I'm a small-town police officer, and when I was assigned to watch over a cabin in the woods for a night, it seemed like an easy task. The cabin belonged to a retired officer who had recently passed away, and his family wanted to keep an eye on it until they decided what to do with it. My job was to patrol the cabin every few hours to make sure nothing was wrong. The cabin was in the middle of a thick forest, far from the nearest house. My job was to keep an eye on the place and make sure no one was breaking in. The cabin was old and creaky, but it had a kind of old-fashioned charm. I got there just before dark and set up my patrol plan, writing everything down in the logbook. Around midnight, I decided to walk around the cabin. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and a distant bird call. I didn't see anything strange until I got to the back of the cabin. That's when I noticed fresh footprints leading up to the back door. My heart started racing. I checked the door. It was locked, but the footprints went around the side of the cabin. I followed them carefully, shining my flashlight through the dark. The tracks led to a small shed behind the cabin. I approached the shed, my nerves on edge. The shed was old and looked like it hadn't been used in years. I slowly opened the door, and it creaked loudly. Inside, I found old tools and dusty furniture. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I spotted a small, dusty box in the corner. The box was open, and inside were old photos and papers. I picked up a photo and looked at it. It showed the retired officer with a group of men, all smiling and holding what looked like hunting rifles. Then, my flashlight beam moved and revealed something that made my blood run cold. There was a dark stain on the floor beneath the box, looking almost like spilled coffee but much more disturbing. I crouched down to look closer and realized it was dried blood. My mind raced. Why was there blood here and what had happened in this cabin? I called for backup and decided to wait by the cabin until they arrived. As I stood outside, I heard footsteps coming from the forest. I froze, swinging my flashlight towards the noise. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin, and I saw a shadowy figure through the window. Backup arrived quickly. Together, we searched the area but found nothing. The shadowy figure had disappeared, and the footprints in the shed were gone. We thoroughly checked the cabin and the shed, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could explain the blood or the figure I had seen. The case was never solved. The retired officer's family eventually decided to sell the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened there. Every time I drove past the cabin, I couldn't help but feel that the forest was hiding something. It was as if whatever had been in that cabin was still out there, waiting for someone else to uncover the truth. The feeling that something was watching me from the trees never left me, a constant reminder of the dark secrets buried in that quiet, forgotten place. I was stationed at a small outpost, far from anything familiar. The cabin we were assigned to wasn't much, just an old wooden shack barely big enough for 4 of us. It was stuck at the edge of a thick forest, the kind where the trees were so close together that barely any sunlight made it through, even during the day. Once you stepped into the trees, you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. It was dark, even when the sun was up. At first, the loneliness didn't really bother me. We were used to tough situations in the army, and this just felt like another mission. Days passed slowly, filled with routine checks, fixing up gear, and waiting for any new orders. But after a few weeks, the place started to get to me. It wasn't anything I could point out exactly, just a feeling. At night, the wind would howl through the trees, making strange noises. Sometimes it sounded like whispers, like someone was just out of sight, standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. One night, I was on guard duty while the others were sleeping in the cabin. I sat on the porch, staring out into the darkness. It was dead quiet. Not even the usual rustling of leaves or sounds of animals moving around. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, and that's when I saw it. Something barely there, moving between the trees. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. I pointed the flashlight in its direction, but whatever it was had already slipped back into the shadows. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting, but nothing happened. Still, the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away, like something was pressing down on my chest. The next morning, I told the guys about what I saw, but they shrugged it off. Animals were common in this area, nothing to worry about. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, more weird things started happening. Small things went missing: food, gear, stuff that couldn't just disappear on its own. One of the guys thought he heard footsteps outside the cabin late at night, but when we checked, there was no one there. Yet that feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Then one night, it all got worse. It was pitch black outside, and we were all inside the cabin, trying to get some sleep. Out of nowhere, there was a loud bang, like something heavy had smashed into the side of the cabin. We all jumped out of bed, grabbed our rifles, and ran outside. The cold night air hit me hard, and everything was silent. Too silent. I swept my flashlight around, and that's when we saw it. A huge tree, just a few feet from the cabin, had been pulled out of the ground. Its roots were sticking up into the air. There had been no storm, no strong wind. Nothing could have caused that. No sign of anyone around, no tracks in the dirt. It hit me then. Someone or something was messing with us. We stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to check the tree line, see if I could find any tracks or clues about what was out there. As I walked into the forest, the air felt thick, like something was weighing it down. My skin crawled, like I was being watched. Every few steps, I stopped and looked around, my heart beating faster with each pause. Then I saw it again, the figure, just standing there, barely visible between the trees, watching me. This time, I didn't wait. I lifted my rifle and stepped forward, but the figure bolted. I chased after it, my legs moving faster than I thought they could as I ran deeper into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. But after a few minutes, I stopped. The figure was gone, swallowed by the trees. My breathing was heavy, and as I stood there in the quiet, the truth of what was happening sank in. Whatever it wasn't just some animal. It was watching us, testing us. It was smart, waiting for the right moment. I made my way back to the cabin, the silence of the forest closing in on me. When I got back, I told the others what I had seen, but we didn't need to talk about it. We all knew something was out there, something we couldn't explain. We decided to pack up and leave at first light, but that night was the longest night of my life. None of us slept. Every noise outside sounded like a threat. Every shadow seemed to move. We sat there, rifles ready, just waiting for whatever it was to make its move. But nothing happened. When the sun finally came up, we packed our things and left. As we drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. It was like the trees themselves had eyes on us. We never found out what had been stalking us. Maybe it's better that way, but the feeling stayed with me long after we left. Even now, I can't help but think about those eyes in the dark, following us as we drove off. It wasn't over. I know it's still out there, waiting for the next group to show up. I booked a cabin in the Austrian Alps because I needed to get away for a bit. Life had been too busy, and this place seemed like the perfect spot to relax. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees, and there was only a small dirt road leading up to it. When I arrived, I got out of the car, took a deep breath of the cool mountain air, and started unpacking. The view was amazing, and everything was so quiet. It felt like I was the only person around for miles. The cabin was old but clean. Inside, it had everything I needed: a fireplace, a little kitchen, and one bedroom. Over the next few days, I spent my time walking along the trails nearby, breathing in the fresh air and enjoying the silence. Sometimes, I'd hear animals moving around in the woods, but it was nothing that made me worry. At night, the wind would get louder, howling through the trees, but the cabin was sturdy, and I always felt warm and safe. It seemed like the perfect place to be. One evening, just before the sun went down, I decided to try a trail I hadn't walked before. It was steeper than the others and led further into the woods. After about an hour, the trail became harder to see, almost disappearing under the fallen leaves. The trees were getting closer together, and the shadows were growing longer. Part of me thought about turning back, but something made me keep going. It was like I had to see what was ahead. After another half hour of walking, I came across an old, broken-down shed in the middle of the forest. It looked like no one had touched it in a long time, maybe years. I got closer, but the whole thing felt strange, like it didn't belong there. The ground around it was messy, like something had walked through it recently, and I could smell something faint like burned wood. I didn't go inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been there not too long ago. I hurried back to the cabin before it got too dark, but as I walked, I felt uneasy, like something was watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me, just the quiet woods. Still, the feeling stuck with me all the way back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees were making all kinds of noises. As I lay in bed, I told myself that I was just spooked from finding that old shed. But around midnight, I heard something outside. This wasn't the wind. It was slow, heavy footsteps, like someone walking on the gravel outside the cabin. I froze. The footsteps were steady, moving around the cabin. I listened as they got closer, stopping right outside my bedroom window. My heart was racing, and I didn't move a muscle. There was a long pause, and then I heard a light scraping noise against the wall, like a branch or something else brushing against the wood. I held my breath and waited for the sound to go away. It took a while, but eventually, everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, lying there, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. As soon as the sun came up, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to stay any longer. But as I loaded my stuff into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh footprints in the dirt right outside the cabin. They didn't belong to me. I got in the car and drove off without looking back. The whole way down the mountain, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped for coffee, trying to calm myself down. I told myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that there was nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me that night. A few weeks later, I did some research on the area around the cabin. There wasn't much information online, but I did find something that made my blood run cold. A hiker had disappeared in those woods about 15 years ago. They never found him. His last known location? Not far from where I had found that old shed. Now, every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder who or what was walking around my cabin. Maybe it wasn't the wind that woke me up. Maybe someone was there, standing just outside my window, watching me the whole time. And the thought that gets under my skin the most? They never found the missing hiker. Maybe they never looked in the right places. Or maybe they didn't want to find him. My mom and I decided to spend a weekend at an old cabin she used to visit when she was young. It was deep in the woods, far from any town or other people. She always said it was peaceful out there, so I thought it would be nice to get away for a few days. When we got there, the cabin looked old and worn out. The wood was dark, and the porch creaked with every step. Inside, it was basic, just a few rooms with old, dusty furniture. The smell of damp wood was heavy in the air. There was no electricity, just lanterns and a fireplace to light the place up. It felt like we were completely cut off from the world. The first night was calm. We had dinner, talked a bit, and went to bed early. I woke up a few times during the night, hearing noises outside, branches snapping, leaves moving, but it seemed normal for the woods. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel different. My mom went to bed early again, so I stayed up in the living room by myself, reading. The only light was from the lantern flickering beside me. The silence felt thick, almost like the woods had gone still. I started to feel a bit uneasy and put the book down. That's when I heard it. A light tapping sound coming from the front door. At first, I thought it was an animal or maybe a branch hitting the wood. But the tapping was too steady, too controlled. It didn't stop, just kept going, slow and even. I stared at the door, feeling a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Something was standing right outside. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. But the tapping kept getting louder, like whatever was making the noise was getting frustrated. My stomach turned, and I stood there frozen, not daring to move. I didn't want to make a sound. Then, as quickly as it started, the tapping stopped. The silence was so heavy it felt like the air had thickened. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. I started to walk toward my mom's room to check on her. But just as I moved, I heard something else. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was a soft scraping sound, coming from the side of the cabin. It was like something was dragging itself along the outside walls, moving slowly. The sound crept around the cabin, stopping every few feet, then starting again. My heart pounded as I stood there, listening to it get closer. I didn't know what to do. I glanced toward my mom's room, thinking maybe I should wake her, but I stayed still. I didn't want to scare her or admit how scared I was. The scraping finally stopped by the back door. I stood frozen, holding my breath. For a while, there was nothing. No noise, no movement. I almost started to believe it was over, that maybe it was just an animal. But then, I heard the back door creak. It didn't open, but it sounded like someone was testing it, pushing against it just enough to make the wood groan. That was it. I couldn't stay still anymore. I ran to my mom's room and shook her awake. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We just sat there listening. But the noise didn't come back. The cabin was silent again. We stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting together in her room, waiting for something to happen. But the cabin stayed quiet. When the sun finally came up, we didn't waste time. We packed up and left without even eating breakfast. Neither of us talked about what had happened. On the drive back, my mom kept staring out the window, her face pale and tight. She didn't look back at the cabin, not even once. I didn't either. We never talked about that weekend again. But I noticed my mom never suggested going back to that cabin. It was like we both agreed without saying anything that it was best to forget about it. But I can't forget. The tapping, the scraping, the way the door creaked under pressure. It's all stuck in my head. Sometimes, late at night, I lie in bed and hear it all over again, as if it's still out there. I keep thinking about how whoever or whatever was outside that night, it wasn't trying to get in. It already knew we were inside. It just wanted us to know that too. I'd been looking forward to this weekend at my grandfather's old cabin in the woods for months. It was a chance to get away from the daily grind and enjoy some peace and quiet. The cabin was an old, weather-beaten building tucked away in a far corner of the forest. My grandfather left it to me when he passed away, and it was my first time staying there alone. The drive up was smooth, and I unpacked my things into the cabin before getting comfortable for the night. The place was just as I remembered. The wooden floors creaked, the furniture was old and simple, and the smell of pine filled the air. I got a fire going in the old stone fireplace and settled down with a book, enjoying the warmth and the crackling flames. As night fell, the forest outside grew strangely silent. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant animals faded away, replaced by an eerie quiet. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just because of the remote location. Just as I was about to head to bed, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside the cabin. I thought it might be a raccoon or some other small animal, but the scratching continued. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin, near the storage shed. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed a flashlight to check it out. I stepped outside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The scratching sound stopped as soon as I approached the shed. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Deciding it was probably just an animal, I went back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been dropped. My heart raced as I lay in the dark, straining to hear any more noises. The silence returned, even more intense than before. I decided to check around the cabin, but everything seemed fine, and there was no sign of anything out of place. I went back to bed, but sleep was hard to come by. Around 3 a.m., I heard a thump and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged. This time, it was definitely coming from the direction of the shed. A cold feeling settled in my stomach, but I forced myself to get up and check it out. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside again, more on edge this time. The dragging sound stopped as soon as I reached the shed. I opened the door slowly and shone the flashlight inside. The shed was empty except for a few old tools and a pile of firewood. But then I noticed something unsettling. A long, deep scratch mark on the inside of the shed's wooden door. It looked like it had been made by something with sharp claws or a heavy, rough object. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I went back inside, locked the shed door, and checked all the windows and doors of the cabin to make sure they were secure. The rest of the night was nerve-wracking, but nothing else happened. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I spent the day packing up my things, eager to leave. I did one last check of the cabin and shed before driving away. Back home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to call a local handyman to secure the cabin and check for any signs of break-ins or damage. The handyman found no evidence of forced entry, but mentioned that the scratch marks on the shed door were strange and suggested installing better security measures. I never went back to the cabin after that. The thought of spending another night there, alone in the quiet with whatever made those scratching noises, was too unsettling. I later learned from a neighbor that a family living nearby had gone missing years ago. They had heard scratching noises at their cabin too. The police never found them, and no one knows what happened. The memory of that weekend stayed with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes silence is the most terrifying sound of all. I always thought getting away from the city and staying in an old cabin deep in the woods would be relaxing. I found this cabin online that looked perfect. The pictures showed a small, beat-up cabin tucked away between the trees. I figured spending a few nights there alone was just what I needed to clear my mind. When I got there, it was more isolated than I had imagined. No cell service, no neighbors, just miles and miles of thick forest. The cabin looked even older in person. The wood was turning gray, cracking in places, and the roof seemed to droop a bit. The windows were covered in dirt and grime, but I didn't care. Felt like stepping back in time. I unpacked, started a fire, and settled in for the night. That first night was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, just this strange, heavy silence. It felt off, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being so far away from people. The second day, things started to get weird. I decided to walk around the woods a bit, but as I wandered, I noticed signs that someone had been there recently. There were old tire tracks in the dirt, leading deeper into the forest. I hadn't seen any other cars on the way up, so it was strange. Then, not far from the cabin, I came across a rusty, broken-down car hidden behind some bushes. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Why would someone leave it there and not come back for it? That night, the feeling that something was off really started to get to me. I kept hearing noises outside. It sounded like soft footsteps just beyond the trees, like someone was walking around but never getting close. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The sounds were too steady, too slow. By the third day, I was on edge. That weird feeling stuck with me like a heavy weight on my chest. I stayed close to the cabin, barely venturing out. The silence that had seemed peaceful before now felt almost threatening, like the whole forest was watching me. I stayed near the fireplace, where I could keep an eye on the front door and windows. The quiet no longer felt calm. It felt like something was about to happen. That night, I decided to go to bed early. I locked the doors, shut the windows tight, and lay down, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was safe. Then, I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the front door. It was slow at first, like someone dragging their fingers across the wood. My heart started racing. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. It got louder, more forceful, like something was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the window, my hands shaking. I didn't dare open the door, but I had to see what was out there. I shined the light through the window, but at first, I saw nothing, just the empty porch and the dark trees. Then the beam of light caught something. Deep scratches carved into the wood of the door. They weren't there before. A wave of panic hit me hard. Whatever had been outside was right there, close enough to touch the door, and it had been trying to get in. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. I was completely alone, stuck in this old cabin with something waiting outside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, staring at the door, waiting for the sun to come up. The scratching sound never came back, but the silence outside was somehow worse. It felt like something was still out there, watching, waiting for me to make a move. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things as fast as I could. I was ready to leave. When I stepped outside, that's when I saw it clearly. The scratches on the door weren't random. They were long and deep, like they had been made by someone with purpose, someone trying to get in. Not by an animal. I threw my stuff into the car and took off without looking back. I drove as far as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there hadn't just been watching from the trees. They were closer than I ever realized, waiting for the right moment to come inside. And the worst part? I don't think I was the first person they were waiting for, and I won't be the last. I was really looking forward to a quiet weekend at the cabin. It was way out in the woods, far from the city, and I had been there a few times before. There was no internet, barely any phone signal, but that's what I liked about it. Just peace, quiet, and a break from everything. When I got there, it looked just like I remembered. Small, cozy, and surrounded by nothing but trees. After dropping my bags inside, I started a fire in the wood stove and settled down. The air was cool, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Felt peaceful at first. As the sun went down, the cabin got darker. The shadows from the trees stretched across the windows, making everything look longer and strange. I lit a few candles and picked up a book. But even though I tried to focus on the words, I couldn't shake this weird feeling, like something wasn't right. You know when you just know something's off, but you can't say what it is? That's how it felt. At first, I told myself it was just because I was alone. Being out there, far from everything, can make you a little on edge. But every time I looked out the window, it felt like the darkness outside was looking back at me. I didn't like it. I decided to check the doors, even though I knew I had locked them. Front door locked, back door locked, windows closed. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but that uneasy feeling stuck with me. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. Every little sound outside seemed louder than it should have been. I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves outside, but maybe it was just an animal. I stayed in bed, telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. After a while, I finally fell asleep, but it wasn't a deep sleep. I kept waking up every now and then, feeling like something wasn't right. In the middle of the night, I woke up again. It was so quiet, no sound at all, not even the wind. My heart started pounding, even though I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a soft creak of the wooden floor inside the cabin. I froze. It wasn't the usual house sounds. It was different. It sounded like someone was stepping carefully on the floor. I stayed perfectly still, listening hard. There it was again, a quiet creak, closer this time. My mind was racing. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. No one even knew I was here, but someone was inside. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Slowly, I reached under the bed for the heavy flashlight I had brought. Another creak, this time right outside my bedroom door. I could hear them standing on the other side of the door. Whoever it was, they were just standing there, listening, waiting. I lay there, feeling my heartbeat in my ears, trying to figure out what to do. I could either stay frozen and hope they wouldn't come in, or I could try to make a run for it. I didn't have much time to think. I gripped the flashlight tighter. Then the door handle turned. Slowly, like they didn't want to make any noise, the door started to open. I jumped out of bed, swinging the flashlight toward the door. The light hit an empty room. No one was there, but I knew what I heard. Someone had been standing there. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in a chair with my back against the wall, holding the flashlight, my eyes glued to the door, just waiting. As soon as the sun came up, I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't stop walking until I was back at my car, parked a few miles away. I threw everything in and started the engine, but before driving off, I looked back at the cabin. Stood there, quiet, just like it always did. But something had been there with me. I didn't imagine it. Someone had been inside that cabin. A few weeks later, I heard on the news that hikers found an old, run-down cabin in those woods, not too far from where I'd been staying. Inside, they found signs that someone had been living there. Trash, old clothes, but no one was around. No one knew who it was or where they went. I don't know if it was the same cabin or if it was close by, but I can't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me that night. Maybe they're still out there. And I wonder if I had stayed one more night, would I have made it out of there? Or would I be the next story they found?